Oh, hi. Welcome to the podcast. It's the Godward Show. I'm your host, Casey. If you've ever found yourself too deep into politics, or really anything, and you're looking for a way out, and hey, it happens to the best of us, there are two sources of relief that I can recommend based on personal experience. These are reliable. The first one is classical music. Nobody taught me this, by the way. I discovered this all on my own when I was about 22, 23 years old. Actually, I had read some book. It might have even been I can't even remember, but someone just mentioned how beneficial it had been to them to read Rachmaninoff, or to listen to Rachmaninoff. And I was like, I don't know who that is, so I'll try it. And I went to the record store. That's how old I am, to the, CD store. And got one of those discs, CDs, and listened to it about 10 times. And that's what I'm going to say here is basically it doesn't even matter, at least when you're starting out. Just choose a symphony or a concerto or something and learn it. And what do I mean by learn it? I mean you learn a symphony by listening to it 10 times, and then you know it. You can nod your head to it and so on. If you listen to it 20 times, it's usually yours for life. And as a matter of fact, I'm happy to mention this because it is one of the life hacks that I've discovered on my own and feel confident recommending to people. It's also an interesting thing to keep in mind as we continue to think about how humans learn. This is just a digression and just for the record, but sometimes it does involve, doing the work and kind of actively grinding through tough books. But sometimes just put on some Bach, like a concerto or something, and go for a walk and do it for 10 days in a row until your heart learns it for you, while you're daydreaming and looking at the trees and stuff. Try it, seriously. It's good. This is good medicine. Okay, but the other way to escape a thinking vortex is to get this book by Jorge Luis Borges. This is The Collected Fictions, translated by Andrew Hurley, and this seems to be the standard in the bookstores now. It's seriously, it might be, what does it say here? Basically $20, but man, it's so worth it, this book. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Most of the stories in this book are about 5 pages long, and each of them is like a world unto itself. Typically, they involve fascinating thought experiments that seem derived from dorm room philosophy sessions. But the playing out of these thought experiments feels just like you would expect it to if somehow it really happened. For a comparison, think of the famous trolley problem from the typical philosophy 101 class. In Borges, you get similar setups to that. Remember, that's the one where it's the train is heading down the tracks and there's 5 guys on this track and 1 on the other track, and do you flip the switch or something? Things like that kind of happen in Borges, but the way that he shows it, it's hard to explain. I already feel like I'm butchering this, I guess, or botching the episode. But what I want to say is that I think he's probably the most imaginative writer in the modern period, and when you read him, you gain exactly that. It's like his gift to readers. You start to become more imaginative with him. So those what-if thoughts come much easier, and you start to feel much more interested in, what it would be like if X, Y, or Z, rather than constantly being inclined to lobby for one foregone conclusion or another, usually politics, it seems, these days. So it's what if there were 2 gods? What would that be like, right? And then we just kind of just sit around and drink Miller Lights and talk about that. That's how a lot of us managed our early 20s, and that's what was so fun about it. It was conversation, right? You weren't trying to win the debate. If anything, this is what I'm trying to I really am trying to recover this type of, it's kind of dialogue, but really it's more just shit shooting. It's kind of I give you permission to say kind of bananas stuff. Just go for it, man. Just off the wall, whatever. If there are 2 gods, then What? Well, then, like, I guess they would feel jealous of each other, and probably they would want their subjects to take sides, and maybe one of them would, like, actually be subversive but present himself to his subjects as the good one, and the other one the other way. And, like, we're just playing this out. That's all, right? And that's an invitation to flex your imagination. And that's how reading Borges feels to me. Okay, you can read his biography yourself, but I'm just going to mention two things very quickly. He was Argentine, but spent most of his time in his father's library reading English classics. And he also said he loved everything Scandinavian. And then the other thing I should mention is that he was blind by the time he was an adult. And I say that just because I guess he didn't continue reading, although he would have people read to him. But so he dictated a lot of the later stories in his life. He was also, like, rigidly apolitical during a time when everything got political. And so, of course, he was accused of being, like, either reactionary or fascistic or whatever. And for a while, that made it difficult for him to build a reputation with certain editors and so on. Anyway, that was three things, and I'm done on his biography. So in this episode, this is going to be a long shot, but I'm just going to try to summarize one of his short stories. He, first of all, wrote no novels, so we're going to do short stories here. He did write poetry. The poetry I've never really loved because it's in translation. I bet it's pretty good, but so leaving that aside. I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs aloud here and then add just a little bit of commentary to make sure you're getting it, but I assure you, the commentary in this episode will not be relevant or politically edgy or practical or useful or based or anything. This episode is about literary aesthetics. And that's the first thing that would probably strike most of you about Borges. And for many of you, it's probably why you wouldn't read him very much. Like that, I lament to say, but I think that's true. I mean, in fact, actually, before we get to the story, let me also mention that Borges strongly preferred, for example, Edgar Allan Poe to Nathaniel Hawthorne, because in Hawthorne he detected and disliked a strain of parable or allegory, and he despised didactic stories. Didacticism was, according to Poe, and he's right, an aesthetic sin. Being didactic means intending to teach, particularly morally. So whereas Hawthorne's stories sometimes feel infused with moral instruction, Poe's generally do not. And Borges endorses Poe very much for that reason. Well, listen to him say it himself here.
Becoming lessons or parables. What I would think of Melville, one of the great writers of the world, no?
How do you account for the failure of Melville to achieve any recognition during his lifetime? Any significant recognition?
Because people thought of him as writing travel books. I have the 1911 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. There's an article about Melville, and they speak of him much in the same way as they might speak about Captain Marryat, for example, or other writers. I think that he wrote many travel books. People thought of him as writing in that way, so they couldn't see all that the Moby Dick or the White Whale meant.
What part did you play in the rediscovery of Melville?
But in this country, I've done what I could, I suppose.
Had it already been translated when you were a student?
No, when I was a student, no, it hadn't been translated. It had been translated afterwards. And I translated a very fine story of Melville's. You know it, of course, the Bartleby.
Yes. You translated that for the first time?
Yes, for the first time. Then I think we did the first translation of Hawthorne's It's a Wakefield. Mm-hmm. A very fine story. After the manner of Kafka, or rather Kafka came after him, no? But Kafka enabled us to read Hawthorne better, which is what a great writer does. In a sense, he creates the forerunners. He makes people read them in a different way.
Okay, the story I want to talk about today is called Funes el Memorioso, which is hard to translate into English. Basically, it's like Funes the Memorious one or something. The one who remembers, or the elephant memoried, right? So that gives you an idea of what the story is about. And you can see how, like, this is just like a thought experiment, and we're going to see it played out. Basically, like, dude, what if some guy had actually absolutely perfect memory, right? And that's it. Like, that's the premise. Now let's give it a character and, like, set the character in motion. One of the things that we haven't talked nearly enough about on this channel is narrative perspective. Seriously though, I'm sort of joking because I know not everybody's like a nerdy English major, but like sort of seriously, it's a very rich and profound thing to think about, and one that becomes more interesting the longer you think about it. It's especially interesting, for example, with relation to something like news reporting, where the reporter is the narrator. And some news reporters will try to like obscure their own personality. Others will interject their personality. But in both cases, you're probably getting like a shaped story, right? And even if they were somehow objective, the news network itself, which I guess would be the equivalent of like the publisher, is thinking about which stories should be told and so on. So in this story, I mean, in all stories, there is, the distance, and it can be zero, I suppose, in some cases, between the author and his fictional narrator, and then the distance between the narrator and the other characters in the story and the events that he's narrating, and so on. Now, I wish I had mentioned this in my last episode, actually, the one about Bartleby, because it's always seemed to me that the narrator of that story, which is Bartleby's boss, plays a really interesting role in that story. He very much participates in shaping Bartleby's fate. But he also at the same time doesn't seem totally aware of how his participation is shaping things. And again, really interesting in relation to thinking about like news reporting or podcast doing or anything. Like, how aware are you of your participation in the story that you're telling, right? Let's see. Same thing, by the way, since we're talking Melville just briefly, with Ishmael in Moby Dick, right, to some degree. He mostly keeps the focus on Ahab and on whaling, but of course, like he points out in chapter 41 or 42, that he participated also in the, hunt for the whale. He says something like, my shouts went up with the rest of the crew. Okay, so with all that in mind, listen to the first paragraph of Borges' story about Funes, a story which, by the way, Borges himself said in the intro to this collection of stories was a long metaphor for insomnia, but which also seems to be about a lot more than that to me. Okay, so sentence number 1 says, I recall him, and then in parentheses, though I have no right to speak that sacred verb, only one man on earth did, and that man is dead. Holding a dark passion flower in his hand, seeing it as it had never been seen, even had it been stared at from the first light of dawn till the last light of evening for an entire lifetime. End first sentence. So here we have a first-person narrator who is not otherwise identified, and so we kind of imagine it to be Borges himself, I guess. It repeats this phrase, he does. He says over and over again, I recall, I recall, I recall, numerous times in the first paragraph. But at the same time, he very self-consciously suggests that typical human recollection hardly deserves the name compared to what he's going to describe in this story, which is what he once witnessed in this remarkable man, Funes. Okay, so now listen to some more of that first paragraph. And as you hear this next part, consider how physical it is, how specific, how detailed. And then remember, and this is amazing, that it's all fiction, right? It all comes out of Borges' notebooks, his imagination. He says, I recall him, his taciturn face, its Indian features, its extraordinary remoteness behind the cigarette. I recall, I think, the slender leather braider's fingers. I recall near those hands a mate cup with the coat of arms of the Banda Oriental. I recall in the window of his house a yellow straw blind with some vague painted lake scene. I clearly recall his voice, the slow, resentful, nasal voice of the toughest of those days, without the Italian sibilance one hears today. I saw him no more than 3 times, the last time in 1887. I applaud the idea that all of us who had dealings with the man should write something about him. My testimony will perhaps be the briefest, and certainly the slightest, account in the volume that you are about to publish, but it can hardly be the least impartial. So I guess it's like the plausibility, if that's the word, or plausibleness, that first strikes me at the beginning of this story. It's like it's, a remarkable man and a publisher wanting to collect some essays about the remarkable man. I guess it's like Borges telling of his chance encounter with like this strange guy, basically. And it's brought together into like hardly even a story, little more than an anecdote. Here's the rest of the first paragraph. Unfortunately, I am Argentine, and so congenitally unable to produce the dilirem that is the obligatory genre in Uruguay, especially when the subject is an Uruguayan. Highbrow, dandy, city slicker. Funes did not utter those insulting words, but I know with reasonable certainty that to him I represented those misfortunes. Pedro Leandro Ipuche has written that Funes was a precursor of the race of supermen, a maverick and vernacular Zarathustra, and I will not argue the point. But one must not forget that he was also a street tough from Fray Bentos, with certain incorrigible limitations. Well, I guess it's like the immersive nature of Borges' writing that I love so much. In that one paragraph, we know so much about the narrator, about the setting, and we're brought to the edge of our seats anticipating like what it's going to be. I mean, Funes, the Memorioso one? What story am I going to hear about this guy who had a memory, right? Like this seems like this can't be that interesting. But in the paragraphs that follow, we learn pretty quickly that Funes was, and by the way, his full name is Ireneo Funes. We learn that Funes was more or less normal, except that he always knew exactly what time it was, to the minute, until he fell one day and smacked his head very hard. And then after that, he could remember literally everything that happened from that point on. And so kind of here's where like the thought experiment kind of begins. The Borges narrator says that he had seen Funes only once before the fall, and when he heard about the newly manifested eccentricity of mind, he wanted to see him again. The two exchanged a cordial letter. So then Funes invites the narrator over, and hearing through gossip channels that the narrator has a bunch of Latin books, Funes asks him to send the books over, along with a dictionary, and then, quote, for a full understanding of the text, since I must plead ignorance of Latin. And then the narrator scoffs at the idea that anyone could just learn Latin on their own with a dictionary, but he sends the books. So then one paragraph and one day later, Funes' mother invites the narrator into their home and says Funes is out on the porch. Don't be surprised if the lights aren't on, since Ireneo often spent his off hours without lighting the candle. Then, listen to this part. Quote, I walked across the tiled patio and down the little hallway farther on, and came to the second patio. There was a grapevine. The darkness seemed to me virtually total. Then suddenly I heard Ireneo's high, mocking voice. The voice was speaking Latin. With morbid pleasure, the voice emerging from the shadows was reciting a speech or a prayer or an incantation. The Roman syllables echoed in the patio of hard-packed earth. My trepidation made me think them incomprehensible and endless. Later, during the enormous conversation of that night, I learned they were the first paragraph of the 24th chapter of the 7th book of Pliny's Naturalis History. The subject of that chapter is memory. End quote. So Funes has this crazy condition, a real condition, by the way, called hyperthymesia, perhaps only slightly exaggerated for the sake of the story. You can read about actress Mary Lou Henner, who can recall every day of her life back to age 11. And you've probably heard of these people. You say, like, what happened to you on December 15th, 1986? And they go, that was a Tuesday, and it was cold rain, and I was anticipating Christmas, and I was writing, it's like, what? How can they do this? But apparently it's real. Pretty wild, but like, again, all of this kind of only adds to the sense that the story about Funes is plausible. Because, it's like, in a way, it's like, it's so weird that, I guess it's like, and then the tone of Borges while he's telling it. So it's like something very strange, but he's telling it in a way just like you would, which is like, kind of like, hey, listen to this, it's crazy, but not like, it's not a sci-fi story, you know what I mean? Anyway, so this is the next part. Speaking now of Funes' memory. The narrator says, quote, every visual image was linked to muscular sensations, thermal sensations, and so on. He was able to reconstruct every dream, every daydream he had ever had. 2 or 3 times he had reconstructed an entire day. He had never once erred or faltered, but each reconstruction had itself taken an entire day. I myself alone have more memories than all mankind since the world began, he said to me. And also, my dreams are like other people's waking hours. And again, toward dawn, my memory, sir, is like a garbage heap. A circle on a blackboard, a right triangle, a rhombus. All these are forms we can fully intuit. Ireneo could do the same with the stormy mane of a young colt, a small herd of cattle on a mountainside, a flickering fire and its uncountable ashes, and the many faces of a dead man at a wake. I have no idea how many stars he saw in the sky. It's so amazingly well rendered, isn't he, this Funes character, Funes? When you read of him, you feel that he must have existed. Like it would be impossible to conjure up such a singular individual out of nothing but imagination. Let me read you one more page here, or listen to a clip I found.
Funes, out of the darkness, continued. He told me that toward 1886 he had devised a new system of enumeration, and that in a very few days he had gone beyond 24,000. He had not written it down, for what he once meditated would not be erased. The first stimulus to his work, I believe, had been his discontent with the fact that 33 Uruguayans required 2 symbols and 3 words, rather than a single word and a single symbol. Later, he applied his extravagant principle to the other numbers. In place of 7,013, he would say, for example, Máximo Pérez. In place of 7,014, the train. Other numbers were Luis Melian, La Finur, Olimar, Brimstone, Clubs, the Whale, Gas, the Cauldron, Napoleon, Augustin de Videa. In lieu of 500, he would say 9. Each word had a particular sign, a species of mark. The last were very complicated. I attempted to explain that this rhapsody of unconnected terms was precisely the contrary of a system of enumeration. I said that to say 365 was to say 3 hundreds, 6 tens, 5 units, an analysis which does not exist in such numbers as the Negro Timoteo or the flesh blanket. Funes did not understand me, or did not wish to understand me. Locke, in the 17th century, postulated and rejected an impossible idiom in which each individual object, each stone, each bird and branch had an individual name. Funes had once projected an analogous idiom, but he had renounced it as being too general, too ambiguous. In effect, Funes not only remembered every leaf on every tree of every wood, but even every one of the times he had perceived or imagined it. He determined to reduce all of his past experiences to some 70,000 recollections, which he would later define numerically. 2 considerations dissuaded him: the thought that the task was interminable, and the thought that it was useless. He knew that at the hour of his death, he would scarcely have finished classifying even all the memories of his childhood. The 2 projects I have indicated, an infinite vocabulary for the natural series of numbers, and a usable mental catalogue of all the images of memory, are lacking in sense, but they reveal a certain stammering greatness. They allow us to make out dimly or to infer the dizzying world of Funes. He was, let us not forget, almost incapable of general, Platonic ideas. It was not only difficult for him to understand that the generic term dog embraced so many unlike specimens of differing sizes and different forms. He was disturbed by the fact that a dog at 314, seen in profile, should have the same name as the dog at 315, seen from the front.
And that's pretty much the gist of the story. I mean, nothing really happens. The final sentence of the story is simply, Ireneo Funes died in 1889 of pulmonary congestion. Very mundane ending to solidify the plausible, aura of the story, right? Maybe what's most interesting about the story is the voice of the narrator, who is consistently curious but not overawed, so that he can both see the remarkableness of Funes, even as he relates for readers everything we need to know to share in his knowing and his reasonable awe, right? His commentary on Funes is interesting, but sort of tentative, as if he is, like us, only doing his best to imagine what it's like to be Funes. He says at one point, quote, "He was the solitary, lucid spectator of a multiform, momentaneous, and almost unbearably precise world. Babylon, London, and New York dazzle mankind's imagination with their fierce splendor. No one in the populous towers or urgent avenues of those cities has ever felt the heat and pressure of a reality as inexhaustible as that which battered Ireneo day and night in his poor South American hinterland. It was hard for him to sleep. To sleep is to take one's mind from the world. Funes, lying on his back on his cot, in the dimness of his room, could picture every crack in the wall, every molding of the precise houses that surrounded him." End quote. And even if this doesn't turn out to be your favorite Borges story, chances are there's one for you. I read The Garden of Forking Paths, which has more twists and turns than an average Bond movie, all in about 6 pages. It's about, that story is about a choose-your-own-adventure style book and fate and identity. Amazing. And again, in 6 pages. Or try Pierre Menard, author of The Quixote, which, seriously, is an amazing story. It's about a minor author of the 20th century who conceived the project of kind of internalizing Don Quixote, the story, until he got it into his bones, basically, and then from memory, but not from memory, but from his guts, from his heart, authentically rewrite one chapter of Don Quixote, but not in the way where he's copying it or reciting it. You understand? But listen, I mean, that doesn't make sense summarized. Listen to how it goes in the story. It's hilarious. The narrator says, "Initially, Pierre Menard's method was to be relatively simple. Learn Spanish, return to Catholicism, fight against the Moor or Turk, forget the history of Europe from 1602 to 1918, be Miguel de Cervantes. But it turns out that is too easy and inauthentic. And so the narrator says, to be a popular novelist of the 17th century in the 20th seemed to Menard to be a diminution. So no, it's not that simple. Instead, Menard needs to write out a chapter of the Quixote from his own mind, you understand? And not in the 17th century, in the 20th. Not merely as a copy, but as if it were a fresh story, as if it were written anew in the 20th century. Though perhaps for different reasons, of course, right? That chapter must exist now in 1920, as it did then in 1602 or whatever. Menard is writing a historical novel, right? Whereas the original was a contemporary picaresque novel. Look at this excerpt. It's amazing on your screens. It is a revelation, this is from the story, it is a revelation to compare the Don Quixote of Pierre Menard with that of of Miguel de Cervantes. Cervantes, for example, wrote the following, Part 1, Chapter 9, quote, "Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and future's counselor." The catalogue of attributes written in the 17th century and written by the ingenious layman Miguel de Cervantes is mere rhetorical praise of history. Menard, on the other hand, writes, quote, "Truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, depository of deeds, witness of the past, exemplar and advisor to the present, and future's counselor." History, the mother of truth? The idea is staggering. Isn't that hilarious? Like, that's so funny and also so freaking interesting. Like, I suppose in a similar way, Borges himself could only have existed in the 20th century, at the height of modernism, or as one of the first postmodernists. But he is also absolutely timeless and like from nowhere. Listen to this clip of Borges talking to, what's his name? You'll recognize, Buckley.
Well, now, you say that you spend most of your time reading the older writers now. Is it because you reject the newer writers, or because you choose to continue to be unfamiliar with them?
Because I'm afraid that I'll find the new writers more or less like myself. I'm afraid
You won't.
Well, I suppose I will. I suppose all contemporaries are more or less alike, no? The scientists like what I write. I prefer going back to the 19th, to the 18th century, and then, of course, also going back to the Romans, since I have no Greek, but I had Latin. Of course, my Latin is very rusty, but still, as I once wrote, the fact that I've forgotten Latin is already is in itself a gift.
Yes.
To have known Latin and forgotten it is something that sticks to you somehow.
And it has to
But I have done most of my reading in English. I read very little in Spanish. Because I was educated practically in my father's library, and that was compounded of English books. So when I think of the Bible, I think of the King James Bible. When I think of the Arabian Nights, I think of Lane translation or of Captain Borges translation. When I think, of course, of Persian literature, I think in terms of Brown's Literary History of Persia and, of course, of Fitzgerald's. And in fact, I remember the first book I read on History of South America was Prescott's Conquest of Peru.
Is that right?
Yes, and then I fell back on Spanish writers. But I have done most of my reading in English. I find English far finer language than Spanish.
Why?
Well, there are many reasons. Firstly, English is both a Germanic and a Latin language. It goes two registers. For example, for any idea you take, you have two words. Those words do not mean exactly the same. For example, if I say regal, they're not exactly the same thing as saying kingly. Or if I say fraternal, it's not the same as saying brotherly. Or dark and obscure. Those words are different. It will make all the difference, speaking, for example, of the Holy Spirit. It will make all the difference in the word in the poem if I wrote about the Holy Spirit and not about the Holy Ghost. Since ghost is a fine, dark Saxon word, while spirit is a light Latin word. Well, and then there's another reason. The reason is that I think that of all languages, English is the most physical of all languages.
The most what?
Physical.
Mm-hmm.
For example, he loomed over. You can't very well say that in Spanish.
Asomó?
Well, no, but not exactly the same. And then in English you can do almost anything with verbs and prepositions. For example, to laugh off.
Okay, look, I mean, there definitely is no way to like meaningfully summarize the corpus of Borges' collection of short stories, but I'm telling you, if you want to read good stuff, but you run out of patience on big novels and Thucydides and the Bible, this is a great value. Most of his stories take less than 30 minutes to read, and many of them will stick with you for a long time and provoke really interesting ideas. I mean, sometimes we get stuck in a rut, right? We think we could fix America's healthcare system or its border crisis, or we see international banking as a problem, and we want to explain it to everybody who isn't paying attention. But have you ever considered obsession, like Borges does in his story The Zahir? Or what dead men might think about and talk about? Or what it would be like to meet yourself, or to have Shakespeare's memory? Or how Dante must somehow have seen a leopard in a cage, and how that leopard might have understood that his entire imprisoned life was important, so that a Florentine poet might best explain how impossible it is to live an entire life without sinning, and so on. Or how, as in the story of Thunes, Platonic ideas must exist. Abstraction is necessary to keep us from literally losing our mind in specifics, innumerable specifics. I mean, it is super interesting, isn't it, to think about that? Like, I mean, I love to go for a walk. Like, I've been living in the same neighborhood for 11 years now or so, and my favorite time of year is happening outside right now. Like, there's the big, cherry trees are blooming white, and the magnolias are that hot pink, almost purple color. My maple tree has those red little whirligig seeds all over it, and the grasses are starting to grow, and the iris flowers are blooming, and like there's the petals of the leaves are all blowing all over the sidewalk outside, and the hawks are fighting with the crows, and the dogwood thing is starting to hatch. And there's a lot going on out there, and I've seen it for 10 years, and I like it every year. But it's like there's this like double movement that happens in your mind. Think of, I hope you can think of the beauty of a dogwood flower. And you, like, on one hand, it's the singular, it's like you have to go up to one and look at it and see close up the dogwood flower, right? But it's like, man, once you've seen that, and you've seen it again year after year, it's hard to keep seeing it with new eyes. And like, what happens is your mind starts to make it into an abstraction, almost a word, and you start to be like dogwood flower, and like, you kind of pin it to the board with all the other butterflies that are dead because you pin them to the board and categorize them and so on. And like, that's the world that Funes lived in, the world where you never do that. Like, did you catch that line in the clip I played where it says he was like sort of horrified by the fact that there weren't more than one word? When we look at the dog head on at 3:14 or in profile at 3:15, he's like, why aren't there two words for that? And isn't his thing about language funny? Like, he's going to make up a language that would be, or like like a numbering system where instead of a system, just every number has a different word associated with it. And I love that joke where it's, instead of the word 500, he said 9. Just, it's so fun to think like this, because what it does is then it liberates your own brain to start thinking bizarre, fun, unusual, outside the box, non-conformist thoughts. And like, that's liberation, man. That's liberation. You got to go for that. You got to go in that direction now and then. Get this book and thank this man for being so good. All right, I'll see you next time. I don't know. I don't really have the next episode planned, so I think we do. Oh, we do have. What day is today? It's Thursday. We do have a secret stream tomorrow night, Friday. Maybe we could talk some more about like reason and the Dionysian and how that fits in with like idealism and categorization as opposed to sensation. These kinds of things would be interesting talk maybe. Okay, I'll talk to you, some of you tomorrow night, the patrons. If you're still interested in joining, the link's in the description. Bye-bye.